Today on Know the Truth with pastor and Bible teacher Philip de Courcy.
God alone knows the future. God alone lives forever. You ought to say, if God wills, you'll do this and do that. James wants us to affirm that anything we are and anything we have is due to the providence of God.
Well, it's happened to the best of us. Maybe it was the unmet anticipation of a spring bonus or a hefty tax return. Or perhaps it was a carefully crafted evening that went sour. No matter how carefully we plan, there's always a chance things will turn out much differently than we expected. Today on Know the Truth, Pastor Philip considers how life's uncertainties highlights our ultimate reliance on God. Our message, Man Proposes But God Disposes. He's senior pastor of Kindred Church in Anaheim Hills, California. Here's Philip de Courcy.
Napoleon, at the height of his career, is reported to have given this cynical answer to someone who asked him if God was on the side of France. Napoleon answered, God is on the side that has the heaviest artillery. Then came the Battle of Waterloo and the victory of the Duke of Wellington, where Napoleon lost both the battle and subsequently his empire. Years later, in exile on the Isle of St. Helena, chastened and humbled, Napoleon is reported to have quoted the words of Thomas à Kempis when he said, probably reflecting in his own life, both the successes and the losses, man proposes, but God disposes. Man proposes, but God disposes. Napoleon had been thrown from his high horse that God might remind him that life must be lived with reference to him. You and I need to be reminded often, because we soon forget, much like Napoleon, that life must be lived with deference to God and dependence upon him. Proverbs tells us in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 1 that God indeed is in control of life. In Proverbs 21 and verse 1, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it wherever he wishes. In Proverbs 16 verse 9, again we're reminded of both the sovereign and providential control of God concerning the affairs of life. Proverbs 16 and verse 9, a man's heart plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. If you scroll on down to verse 33, we read, the lot is cast into the lap, but its very decision is from the Lord. Man proposes, but God disposes. The book of Proverbs reminds us that the movement of nations, the decisions of kings, the steps of man, and the roll of the dice all fall under the sovereign superintendence and supervision of God. And therefore, we must duly pay deference and show dependence upon God in our daily lives. Men are free to make their choices, but their choices are not free from God. And that's a theme that James picks up here in chapter 4 of his letter. I believe since the beginning of chapter 4 and probably in the latter end of chapter 3, James has been addressing the danger of worldliness seeping into the church. Remember back in chapter 1, he told us that a true religion is marked by certain things. It is marked by a controlled tongue. It is marked by a caring heart. And it is marked by an uncompromising attitude toward the world. And James is concerned that the world is affecting the church far more than the church is affecting the world. And here in chapter 4, in the tail end of chapter 4, James is chastising them for their presumptuousness, for the corrupting power of self-reliance in which they have forgotten their ignorance, their frailty, and their dependence upon God. They seem to be displaying an arrogance that was unbecoming of the church of Jesus Christ. They spoke as if life was a right. They spoke as if their choices were the only deciding factor between success and failure. And so James challenges them here, and there are a number of things here. First of all, what I call the assumption. James chapter 4 and verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even as a vapor that appeareth for a little while and then vanishes away. The assumption regards certain businessmen, it would seem, in this church. It's as if James takes us inside a board meeting of a first century Christian business. Certainly doesn't condemn that. But as they think through their plan to go to a certain catchment area where there is an emerging market and implement a plan that will make a killing financially and commercially in a certain sector, James butts into their conversation. He elbows his way into their boardroom meeting and he says, come on, guys. This kind of talk is unbecoming of the church of Jesus Christ that you profess to belong to as businessmen. He said, I've listened to you, and I've listened to your planning that is bordered on boasting, which is evil and arrogant. Because he says there's someone missing from this table. There's someone who's been left out of this board meeting, and it's God himself. The one you profess as Lord and Master. And so there are certain assumptions. There's a certain presumptuousness in their planning that James addresses and redresses. I got to say something before I say anything else. And it's this. James, as Alex Mortier rightly says, is not trying to banish planning from our lives. James isn't saying that it's wrong for these businessmen to plan. There's nothing wrong with planning. The book of Proverbs in chapter 6 and verse 6 following tells us what? It tells us that there's wisdom in going to the ant and considering her ways, that we might be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard, when you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to the sleep. The wisdom writer in Proverbs is encouraging us to take a look at the ant who gathers and prepares for a long and barren winter, who plans for emergencies and difficulties. In fact, in Proverbs 20 and verse 4, the same principle comes out, where the book of Proverbs says this, the lazy man will not plow because of the winter. He will beg during harvest and have nothing. Again, there's wisdom in preparing. There's wisdom in planning. You need to sow your seed at a certain time of the year if you are to enjoy a harvest later on. The Bible doesn't condemn planning. The Bible doesn't condemn preparing. I don't think that the Bible or James chapter 4 here is saying that it's wrong to have a death policy, that it's unchristian to have a 5-year plan. There's nothing wrong with thinking ahead and being thoughtful. In fact, we've probably read too much into the rendering of the King James Version in Matthew 6 when we're told not to take thought about tomorrow. And we misunderstand that rendering of that text to mean that we can be passive and indolent and thoughtless about our future. No, the Bible tells us, look at the ant. Don't be like the young man who doesn't sow his seed in the autumn to reap the harvest in the spring. No, that's fine. James is not trying to banish planning from our lives. He's only trying to challenge that self-sufficiency. That planning that keeps God for Sunday but leaves him out from Monday to Saturday. James wants to challenge those who want only to enjoy a 911 God. Many of us live that way. We like to know that God's on the end of a prayer line and He's there when we need Him. But we don't live in daily dependence and deference to Him. We are what I would call practical atheists. There are philosophical atheists and there are practical atheists. The philosophical atheist is the person, man or woman, who tells you that they do not believe in God, that life has no purpose or plan. They are evolutionists. They are atheists. And that is their creed and that is their commitment philosophically, ideologically, and they live it out. And the Word of God says that the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And we stand ideologically opposed to them. We cock our weapons and we train our artillery towards that kind of thinking. But you know what? If we're not careful, you and I can live like atheists. We can be practical atheists. We can go from Monday to Saturday without deference and dependence upon God, where we don't seek out that quiet time and study His Word and lean not on our own understanding, but in all our ways acknowledge Him. And it seems that these businessmen forgot who they were. And so there was a certain assumption on their part that James wants to address. And he wants to remind them of how, not only how evil their boasting is, verse 16, but how silly in some ways their talk is. James lays bare two weaknesses in their thinking. They were assuming the events of tomorrow, when in reality no human knows what tomorrow holds. And they were not taking into consideration the transitoriness and uncertainty of human life. They may not even be there for tomorrow. They don't know what tomorrow holds, and they don't even know if they're going to be there. And so he chastises them. Come on, fellas. What's all this talk about going to this city and this town, selling this and buying that, and you don't even know what tomorrow holds? And your life is but a vapor. He wants them to think about two things: the mystery of life and the measure of life. And you and I should plan, and you and I should prepare, and you and I should be busy and thoughtful about the unfolding days that make up our lives. But we must plan and we must prepare with these thoughts to the forefront of our thinking. We don't know what will happen tomorrow, and our life is so transitory. He talks about the mystery of life. Here they are talking about what they're going to do next year, and yet James says, you don't even know what you're going to do tomorrow. You cannot tell what tomorrow holds for you, let alone the next year. And he quotes Proverbs 27, verse 1. No man can boast of tomorrow, for no man knows what a day will bring forth. Yesterday is gone, tomorrow is uncertain, and therefore we need to be careful and prayerful. So James challenges them about this presumptuousness on their part. It's not wrong to think about what might happen, but you and I cannot talk in terms as if we are sure it's going to happen. Gone with the Wind is going to be the biggest flop in Hollywood history. I'm just glad Clark Gable will be the one falling on his face and not Gary Cooper. Who said that? Gary Cooper, 1938. Lee DeForest was an American inventor, and he invented the audio tube. He was the pioneer in developing radio and television in the 1920s. He said this, quote, while theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially, I consider it an impossibility, a development of which we need waste little time dreaming. Mahatma Gandhi, May 1940, I do not consider Hitler to be as bad as he is depicted. He is showing an ability that is amazing, and he seems to be gaining his victories without much bloodshed. You ain't going nowhere, son. You ought to go back to driving a truck. Who said that? And to whom did he say it? Well, it was said by Jim Denny, the manager of the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville, and he said it to Elvis Presley after his first performance in September 25, 1954. I'm sure these men wish they could take back their words. They didn't have a crystal ball. No man has a crystal ball. God might give us a general sense of future things and things to come. But as to our own personal histories, no man knows what a day will bring forth. And that's why James redresses this assumption. God alone knows the future. God alone lives forever. And that's why he chastises these men. You ought to say, if God wills, you'll do this and do that. Because if you really thought about the mystery of life and the measure of life, you wouldn't speak so presumptuously. And you wouldn't speak so confidently. And there would be greater humility. And there would be more prayer. And there will be greater thoughtfulness in how you articulate your worldview of things. You and I cannot presume upon the future. When you understand the mystery of life and when you understand the measure of life, he goes on to say, for what is your life? The word what there is a word that carries the idea of what character. Of what character is your life, says James. You speak with such certainty. But he says, if you really understood life at its essence, it's transitory, it's unpredictable, it's surprising, and it passes so quickly. What is your life? What kind of a life are you going to live? It's a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. James is saying that our lives in the scheme of things is like the exhaust fumes that you see around on a winter's morning. It's if you go home tonight after the service and you put your electric kettle on or you put it on your cooker, and after a while it begins to boil for that cup of coffee you're thinking of enjoying, and the steam begins to billow out of the kettle spout. And there it is. You see it, but in a moment it just vanishes away. And James is saying that's what your life's like. Take a man in the prime of his life. One who eats well, has an adequate amount of rest, exercises so his body is in shape. At the end of the day, his life is but a breath, fleeting and uncertain and transitory. Tomorrow soon becomes yesterday, and life is but a puff of smoke. And James wants to remind these men of this fact because they speak with such concreteness. Today, tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city. We'll spend a year there. And we'll buy and sell and make a profit. James says, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And you speak about life with such certainty when life itself is so uncertain. 1 Chronicles 29 verse 15 says, our days on earth are as a shadow. Job 7 verse 7, oh, remember that my life is a breath. Job 9 verse 25, now my days are swifter than a runner. They flee away. They see no good. They pass by like a swift ship, like an eagle swooping on its prey. And there are many beautiful pictures in God's word that remind us, as Job 14 verse 1 says, man who is born of woman is of few days. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and does not continue. It's like the bunch of flowers you bring your wife freshly cut from the florist, and she puts them in a vase with pride, and there they are in the kitchen table for a day or two, and the smell and the look brightens the kitchen. But you know what? Before long you come in and you find them in the bin because they have died. They have served their purpose. It was good while it lasted, but it didn't last. And James is just trying to remind these men that such is their life. And if they really appropriated that and understood that, then they wouldn't assume so much. He says it's okay, guys, to plan. And it's okay, guys, to calendar. But he says, look, write with a pencil, not with an ink pen, because it might have to be erased. The assumption he redresses. It is said that when the Eastern Emperor was crowned in Constantinople in years gone by, that at the moment of his crowning, that a mason would set before His Majesty a certain number of marble slabs, one of which he would choose to become his tombstone and his headstone. And they thought there was some wisdom in reminding the great emperor of the East that at the moment of his success and rise to power, that he needed to remind himself at the end of the day he was a frail and mortal man. And we all need to be reminded of that. We need to understand that God alone lives forever. And God alone knows and determines the future. Which brings us to the affirmation he stresses. The assumption he redresses is verse 13 and 14. Now you have this affirmation in verse 15 and 16 that he stresses. And the affirmation is what? Instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this or that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. James is saying to these businessmen that their plans are subject to approval. They need to go to the head office. They need God's rubber stamp, or else your plans aren't worth the paper they're written on. But that takes us back, doesn't it, to Proverbs 16 and verse 9, which we quoted. Man makes his plans, but the Lord directs his steps. You and I need to acknowledge God's sovereignty. You and I need to understand our total and utter and daily dependence upon God. It is in Him we move and we have our being, and it's only because of God's will we shall live and do this or do that. And so we need to affirm that. James wants us to affirm that anything we are and anything we have is due to the providence of God. Job reminded us, in reminding us of our transitoriness, Job also reminded us, it is the Lord that gives, it is the Lord that takes away. God will decide if you and I live today or die tomorrow. Those are choices that are outside of our control. And James wants us to acknowledge that. He wants us to acknowledge God's sovereignty and God's providence, and that we are utterly dependent upon Him.
It can be deeply discouraging when our carefully made plans are disrupted, and when life feels like it's been turned upside down. Sometimes all we can do is hang on. An important reminder of God's sovereign control from Philip to Courcy. Today's message is titled Man Proposes But God Disposes, and you're listening to Know the Truth. If you'd like to replay or share this message, visit ktt.org or listen on your favorite podcast app by searching for Know the Truth with Philip de Courcy. We're so grateful for everyone who steps forward to support Know the Truth, and when you reach out this month with a gift of any amount, we'll send you the book, I Have My Doubts, How God Can Use Your Uncertainty to Reawaken Your Faith, by author Philip Ryken. Dr. Ryken explores 10 stories of biblical believers who experienced doubt yet remained faithful to God. To request your copy today, call 888-644-8811 or go to ktt.org. And if you're new to Know the Truth or have never reached out before, we would love to send you a free gift, 7 Days of Truth, Resting in God Through Prayer. This devotional offers daily encouragement to trust in a loving Father who hears and answers prayer. Request your copy at ktt.org. Now, here's Pastor Philip with a quick word about an upcoming event.
Yes, August 18th at the Alta Vista Country Club in Placentia, California. I'll be hosting the second annual Know the Truth golf tournament and dinner. And you're invited. I hope you'll join me. To learn more and register, visit ktt.org.
Sounds like fun. Thank you, Pastor Philip. I'm Wayne Shepherd, so glad to have you with us today, but join us Wednesday for another encouraging message from Philip de Courcy here on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."